from a British and a European perspective, this has got much more to do with the sanctity of borders and the fact that you shouldn't allow countries to throw their weight around. Because if Putin gets away with it in Ukraine and Trump gets away with it in Greenland, then nobody is safe, and we're going to spend our whole time living in terror that borders will get changed by force.
The trade bazooka is like a genie out of the bottle. Could it spiral out of control where countries are using it in ways that haven't been foreseen, and that escalates tensions with Donald Trump rather than keeping him in a check and balance?
Is Greenland worth this sort of geopolitical fight that is currently taking place? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. Donald Trump wants Greenland, and if his European allies won't sell it to him, he will hit them with increasingly harsh tariffs until they do. It may not be a military takeover, but it is the weaponisation of trade, with ramifications for the global economy should he follow through. Some European leaders want the EU to activate its so-called trade bazooka of retaliatory measures. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer says a trade war benefits nobody. So will the fight for a bit of Arctic wilderness leave us all feeling the chill? Well, I'm joined now by Mark Leonard, Director of the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's currently travelling through the Swiss countryside on his way to the annual meeting of global leaders in Davos. President Trump's imminent arrival there, of course, offers the prospect of a frosty showdown with Europeans. And our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi is here in the slightly less frosty, but not much, studio. Welcome to you both. Mark, let's start with you on your way to Davos. Donald Trump turning up there on Wednesday. How do you think that's likely to go? I mean, is it going to set off several avalanche warnings?
I think we're beyond that. I think the avalanche is coming down the mountain now, and people are completely electrified by what's happening. It's the biggest crisis in transatlantic relations, at least since Suez. And the way it's unfolding is surreal, and it's something that European leaders are in crisis mode around.
It's surreal, but also pretty terrifying, isn't it?
It would be terrifying if it weren't so absurd, some of the ways that it's going forward. I mean, the letter which Donald Trump sent to the Norwegian Prime Minister, where he said, your government failed to give me the peace prize, so now I'm looking beyond peace, is something which is terrifying, but it's also so far outside of the normal ways that politics and diplomacy are done that it's quite difficult for people to process.
Yeah, we'll come back to that in just a second, but I mean, it is sort of governing by toddler tantrum, isn't it?
It is. I mean, we're in a continent that's in a state of war, that's worried about the future of Ukraine and dealing with the Russian threat. And in the middle of that, which is this land grab for Greenland, and then it's behaving in quite extraordinary ways by threatening to introduce tariffs against countries that sent as few as one troop to take part in a military exercise in Greenland, which is something that Donald Trump himself has been calling for. He said that NATO hasn't done a good enough job of protecting Greenland from Russian and Chinese pressure, and then as soon as they start doing that, they're threatened in this way. So it's very scary, but it is also quite difficult to understand, and it's something that I think needs to be met with real force, because if not, it will set a horrible precedent. And that's something which I think all Europeans failed to do when the tariff war started with Independence Day, and they've fared less well as a result of that than countries like China that have stood up to this kind of bullying.
Well, Helia, let me bring you in at this point to explain what the EU trade bazooka is and what effect it might have.
The anti-coercion instrument. I mean, it could do basically anything. You could cancel banking licenses. You could stop companies from being able to get into procurement. You could stop them operating. You could go after tech companies. Basically, this bazooka, the 93 billion euro bazooka that Macron is talking about, could in one fell swoop get rid of JP Morgan, Facebook and Palantir, the end of American business in Europe. But would it do that? Or would that also derail the European economy?
Well, it would derail the global economy, wouldn't it?
Derail the global economy. And I think what you saw with Brexit is that it's very hard in operational sense to actually try and uproot companies when there's so much trade between them. But this is the tool they have, and at least the threat is something they can go for.
Well, Mark, does the threat of that trade bazooka, will it have the desired effect of bringing Trump back from the brink?
I think there are two things which have been talked about. One was the 93 billion euros worth of tariffs, which is something which was brought in earlier in the year and then was frozen. They target bits of the American economy which are politically sensitive, so things like Boeing, but also, bourbon manufacturers, Harley Davidson, other companies like that. And then the other thing is the anti-coercion instrument, which is a measure that's never been used, that was introduced in 2021, but which gives the European Commission the chance to do the sorts of things that we just heard about.
It's a carte blanche that you get to enact any of these policy choices, and I think that's why it's quite potent. You were talking about the retaliatory tariffs that Europe so far hasn't really got into action over, because it's basically absorbed whatever Donald Trump has unleashed in terms of tariffs. And that's because the European economies are, like Germany, so geared towards exports. But as you were saying, huge impact of this the ACI could do.
But Mark, is it just the threat? Is that what's behind it? That the threat is it's hoped enough to bring Trump back into line, and that's you're not really going to have either these swinging retaliatory tariffs or the far greater bazooka, because it would destroy the global economy, wouldn't it?
Well, I think they're very different. So the tariffs are something which is very bad for consumers and hurts ordinary people. That's why they've chosen particular sectors which are less damaging to European consumers. But there's just been a big study which showed that actually 96% of the costs of tariffs from Independence Day have been borne by American consumers rather than the companies concerned. But Europeans don't want to get into a tariff war. It's definitely something that will hurt the German economy. But the anti-coercion instrument means that you're not retaliating tit for tat. So you can go after bits of the American economy which are much more sensitive to this. And there is a huge dependence on American tech companies that are given a lot of sway in all of our countries. And you could take action against them, which will be much less damaging to European consumers. So the hope is obviously to de-escalate, to have a deal, and to make this go away. No, Europe didn't want territorial threats made against its territory by its greatest ally, and they want to calm the situation down. So they're willing to make these threats. The danger is that they will just get rolled over, and I think that they've learned a lesson from what China did with rare earths. And I think for threats to have an impact, they have to be credible.
Helia, obviously the UK can diverge from the EU on all of this because, since Brexit has the freedom to do that. Do you see that happening, do you think?
Well, I think at the moment the UK is playing the role of the kind of the friendly, the nice officer when Macron is being the hard, tough guy. I talked earlier today exclusively with our business secretary, Peter Kyle, about what the UK would do. It's got a huge impact, as we've seen before, on our car manufacturing, for example. Jaguar Land Rover, car manufacturing in the UK employs 140,000 people, and Jaguar Land Rover was hit massively when Donald Trump first announced tariffs, and it's seen its profits kind of erode, not just because of the cyber attack, but because of the amount of cars being exported. Today, I asked the business secretary, what are you going to do? That you've got your Prime Minister this morning talking about we're going to be an active government. We're going to intercede. We're going to make sure that British companies and British workers aren't hurt by, ramping up tariffs. But what are you actually going to do? Would you put taxpayer money on the line? And he said that he would look at everything. Everything at the moment is on the table.
Mark, can you explain why Sir Keir Starmer this morning in his emergency statement from Downing Street is still reluctant to take on Donald Trump? Does that make any sense anymore?
I think that Britain is obviously in a much weaker position than the European Union and is much more likely to get punished. So if there is a trade war between the EU and the US, the danger is that you face barriers from both the American side and from the European side. And that is something which they're going to try and avoid at all costs. But I think it makes sense not to act unilaterally because it's a lot easier to punish the UK and to pick Britain off than it is the European Union because its economy is much smaller and there's much less dependence on it. So it is a very, very tricky situation to be in.
There is something, though, to be said about the fact that in the UK, we talked about JLR just a moment ago, and there's been lots of talk about AstraZeneca and different pharma companies that could get hit by this. We've got Scotch Industry. But these are companies we can really count on our hands. In Germany, you are talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of companies all across Germany, all across the Mittelstand, who are exporting cars and manufacturing and chemicals to America. So if there is any kind of change to tariffs or trade, the whole country is immediately exposed. At the moment, the UK, although the US is our single biggest export partner, most of our exports are services, which aren't tariffs. So we're slightly insulated.
Mark, you reflected earlier on the kind of surreal nature of what's going on, the madness of it all. I mean, some are saying it's the madness of King Donald. Is it astonishing that still the UK and the EU are sort of holding back? Have we all let him get away with this for too long?
I think we're in a incredibly perilous situation because of the situation in Ukraine, and that is leading European leaders to want to use all the leverage that they have to make sure that we don't have a bad outcome on Ukraine, and that's why they've held back on Venezuela and on other issues. And we're also in a position where it's clear that in the long term, the United States is not a reliable partner on which Europeans can depend, but in the short term, they are our only partner. So the question is, how do you manage to avoid the worst in the short term whilst gradually making yourself less dependent in the long term? And it is a very, very tricky balancing act.
Could you do a Mark Carney? You said you had the Canadian leader, our former governor, talking of the Bank of England, saying on the weekend that we were in a new world order and that China was their new partner. You know, this was the new reality.
Mark, would you advocate adopting a similar approach to Mark Carney?
Look, I think that Canada has been more directly threatened than the UK. Donald Trump talked about making Canada the 51st state, and they are much more dependent on the US than the UK is. But I do think that Carney has shown that Donald Trump respects strength, and he went and did a trade deal with China, and the response of Donald Trump was actually to both praise the deal and then actually to invite Mark Carney to join the Board of Peace in his Gaza peace deal. So it shows that actually he's more likely to treat you with respect if you show that you're willing to stand your ground than if you're desperately scrabbling around trying to get his approval and look weak. And I think the worst sin from Donald Trump's perspective is weakness.
So, Helia, is the reality actually that the UK and the EU are far too reliant on the US in military terms, security terms, for example, to really say what they think at this very perilous moment, as Mark has described it?
I mean, there is a limit to what the UK and Europe can do. It has to look at things. You were talking earlier on about rare earths in Greenland. It's quite interesting, actually, because there were reports last year that the Danish government had interceded on behalf of America in order to make sure that Greenland and Greenland licenses for mining were going to American companies, not Chinese companies. So this whole narrative that has emerged about this is a fight to the death to make sure that you have US supremacy instead of Chinese supremacy and get on America's side. Otherwise, we're all going to be speaking Mandarin before the end of the century. That is undermined by the fact that in Greenland, you have had all attempts by Europeans to do the Americans' bidding.
Mark, is it the case that, Greenland, obviously there are rare earths, they're very deeply buried, very hard to extract. Is Greenland worth this sort of geopolitical fight that is currently taking place?
Well, I think from a British and a European perspective, this has got much more to do with the sanctity of borders and the fact that you shouldn't allow countries to throw their weight around. Because if Putin gets away with it in Ukraine and Trump gets away with it in Greenland, then nobody safe, and we're going to spend our whole time living in terror that different parts of the borders will get changed by force. So I think there is a matter of principle underlining all of this. But I think what you said about the rare earths also is one of the things that is on the side of Europeans. It takes quite a long time for all these things to be extracted and for these things to happen. And there are a lot of things that Europeans can do to make it much more costly for this sort of predatory behavior. And there are ways of both using economic measures, the threat of sanctions and things like that, to the threat of sanctions against companies that get involved and other players, to make it much more uncomfortable for people to get involved in these sorts of predatory operations. And, you know, a lot of Americans also horrified by what's going on at the moment. So I think that we can look beyond the Trump administration and try and both make it difficult for American companies, American hedge funds and other players to be involved in this, but also to use some of the political constraints, because there's a lot of opposition even within the Republican Party to what's going on.
Is it the case, Mark, that Trump can basically get what he wants in Greenland without any kind of military action, or without owning it, as he describes it? You know, with a few relatively easy tweaks, Greenland could give him quite a bit of what he wants.
It can give him everything he wants, unless it's owning Greenland. I mean, there is a treaty in place from 1952, which gives the legal protection for anything that needs to be done. And the Danish Prime Minister has told Donald Trump that short of changing the sovereignty of Greenland, they're willing to accommodate any American concerns. And he said that he wasn't interested in that because he wants to own Greenland. And that's the problem.
Because it's a lease. You only actually protect land that you own. If it's a lease, you wouldn't protect it properly, apparently. That was his argument. But I mean, what's fascinating, Kathy, is that the narrative that's going on in the background, Mark said that we've got to use these political tools to make it uncomfortable. You know, that's what the bazooka does, the ACI does, is it could make it uncomfortable for American investors, American companies, tech companies to operate in Europe, which would help them to exert pressure on their government. But the narrative that has unfolded over recent years from American companies themselves is that the US has been behind in the dash for resources, and that it needs to up its game, that it needs to go faster in making sure that it doesn't allow, at the moment, I think China, it mines, more than 2/3 of all rare earths. It processes 90% of them. It owns all of the end stages of it. So it's able to put in restrictions. And why are rare earths important? Well, because they're in magnets, and they are the fundamental power source for the AI revolution, for our mobile phones, for green energy. And if you're in a situation where you don't have control, then you need to think strategically about changing it.
Mark, how seriously do you think we should take Trump and his threats? Because in the past, you might have scoffed at the idea that he was going to extract the leader of Venezuela and have him turn up in a New York court. But, that happened. Do you think we need to actually take him at his word over Greenland?
Absolutely. I mean, he's been a very, very different sort of president than he was the first time round. And I think that in a whole series of different areas, he's done exactly what he said he was going to do. He is unpredictable. He's mercurial. He behaves in weird ways, as he said to the Norwegian Prime Minister that we discussed earlier. But I think it would be highly negligent to assume that when he's talking, he's not deadly serious. And we have to be equally serious if we want to stop these things from happening.
Well, let's go back to the letter. Just reflect, Mark, on how extraordinary it is.
Bonkers.
I mean, it really is the sort of thing which, if a script writer for the thick of it or somebody like that had come up with, it would never have made its way into production because it's so bizarre. But he literally says that, that he's stopped 8+ wars. Your government, which is, is not the Norwegian government that decides who gets the Nobel Peace Prize. But now that you've decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize, I'm having to look beyond peace. I mean, you can't invent these things.
I think the fact that it goes to the wrong government is just amps up the surreal nature of the complaint.
But I mean, tell us what this letter has done. Now it's been out there. How have people reacted?
Well, I think that's the problem with, you were talking about, are we going to have a taco response, because
Trump
always chickens out, and there was this feeling that there would be a limiting factor because there would be brinkmanship and lots of posturing, but in the 11th hour he would pull back from the brink. And as you said, there have been occasions now where that hasn't happened. And so nobody knows. You had Scott Bessent, who is one of the supposedly sensible people within that administration, on the weekend talking about how Europeans are going to back down over Greenland, how the American stance on Greenland is good for Greenland, it's good for the US, and it's good for Europe. And so some of those stabilizing forces for the most extreme things are not being articulated, although that's different to what we saw with the attack on the Federal Reserve chairman, which is also going on in the background.
Mark, how do you think EU leaders should react to this letter now? Is it a sort of so crazy that they should not even give it the time of day, or do they have to take it head on?
I think the letters and what gets said on Truth Social and things like that are less important than what Europeans do to get their act together to show that they're serious. So I think they're right to call an emergency meeting. I hope that they will agree to trigger the anti-coercion instrument so that they then have the tools that they need to respond if things do escalate. I think they're right to want to try and put this behind us and to find a way of raising the costs so high that it doesn't go any further. And I think there are lots of different things that they can do to both carry on showing their support for Denmark and Greenland. There are economic measures that they can take beyond the anti-coercion instrument, which I talked about, pre-committing to sanctions on people who profit from any occupation of Greenland. They can use the military resources that they have to show that they're serious about Greenland security and to build on the exercise that they've done so far. And they can try and expand the coalition, because the Canadian, we talked about the Canadians, they're sort of equally horrified by what's going on there. Lots of countries around the world that won't feel safe if Donald Trump gets away with this kind of behavior. And so I think they need to hang together. They need to show solidarity to each other. But I think it's less about speaking loudly. It's more about trying to get a bigger stick.
Helia, Trump has achieved the extraordinary feat of uniting the EU, hasn't he now?
Yes, momentarily, let's see. And I think, to Mark's point, that the EU really has to work together to make sure that it's got this coherent voice, which is why the ACI is such a good tool. I think people who are skeptical worry that the bazooka, the trade bazooka, once it's like a genie out of the bottle, once it's out of the bottle, what could happen? Could it spiral out of control, where countries are using it in ways that haven't been foreseen, and that escalates tensions with Donald Trump rather than keeping him in a check and balance? Because it's absolutely right. How do you get to do a Mark Carney and impress him with your power, but not anger him so much that he might send a warship?
Mark, you can see from the scenery that you're nearing Davos. Come back to that in a second. But just spell out, if we get the bazooka, if we get the retaliatory tariffs, how bad is it for the US consumer, the European consumer, and the UK consumer?
It's a lose-lose situation. So the hope is that by doing these things, which are in no one's interests, can calm things down and do find a kind of path back towards sanity. And the reason that this label taco was developed is that when faced with opposition, Donald Trump often does try and do a deal. So I think that this is the responsible thing to do. And if you don't escalate, and if you don't show that you're willing to meet fire with fire, then this will just be the beginning of a whole series of completely outrageous and unreasonable things that come our way.
Is the best hope that Trump's own congressmen and women start standing up to him? Because we're seeing a bit of a sign of that, aren't we, Mark?
Yeah, I think there are limits to how much political heroism we're going to see within the Republican Party, because a lot of people are scared that Trump will organize primaries against them. And so most of the people who've been speaking out have been people who are retiring and who don't have a long-term future in Republican politics on that side of the spectrum. But there are going to be midterm elections. It's quite possible that the Republicans will lose control of the House. And maybe as we move towards that, if there are unpopular things being mooted, that might also focus the minds of Republican candidates.
Tariffs always hurt consumers, but it's more than just the tariffs. We talked about the fact that Germany might be more exposed than the UK, but it would still hurt the UK because just this instability, the uncertainty, means that in an economy that is sort of muddling along, companies stop investing. They don't know what's happening. It all becomes a bit risky, and they stop employing people, and they stop building a new factory, and they stop opening venues, and that stalls the economy. And it's kind of a poison pill, even when you don't get to the hard kind of tariff, and if you're going to ban JP Morgan from banking in Europe.
Mark, you've talked about your hope of de-escalation. How does the king play into all of this? The ultimate sort of symbol of soft power, I guess. I mean, should he still go on a state visit to the US in the spring?
Yeah, look, I think it's important to keep channels open. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, and it is a long-standing ally. I think that part of what you need to do is to find a way of maintaining the relationship, but not being afraid to speak out when things happen which are against the British interest. Donald Trump is both willing to come on state visits, but is also willing to be very critical of British politicians like the Mayor of London and other players. And I think the British government needs to do the same thing. It has to keep the relationship going, but it shouldn't be afraid of standing up to bullying, and it shouldn't be afraid of speaking out when things are being done which go very directly against the British national interest. But that doesn't mean cutting off all relations and isolating ourselves from a very, very powerful country.
Helia.
Well, I was just going to say, the Prime Minister has tried to now make it clear that the government would stick up for UK consumers, UK workers, UK companies. And the question is, well, what would that look like? And so they have to find a way to try and bring the president down from the brink, as Mark was saying.
Mark, final thought from you. You can see the mountains behind you. You're clearly nearing Davos. What kind of reception is Trump going to get? Just give us a sense of the theatrics of all, you've got Nigel Farage, you've got European leaders, you've got Donald Trump. It's going to be quite a display, isn't it?
Yeah, no, well, I remember last year as he was being inaugurated, and he didn't come in person, but he was kind of zoomed in and got, very few of the people on the political side were necessarily thrilled at his election, but they gave him a very warm reception, and the companies were very optimistic that he would bring a lot of growth and energy. I suspect be a slightly more frosty reception this year, but there will be a lot of drama. He'll be the center of attention and will be sucking up all of the oxygen and publicity, which is what I think he likes. So the theatrics I think are the most important thing, and it will be the Donald Trump show while he's in town. There's no question about that.
Well, Mark, I'll let you get ready for the snowball fight. Helia Ebrahimi, Mark Leonard, thank you both very much for joining me. That is it for this edition of The Forecast. Until next time, goodbye.